Hey, Nelson. So first, you should probably send a message to Ben Hewitt because he seemed to think that you guys were about to debate on your issue. But as far as this one goes, let me go into the overall case that I have here. Now, I am making the contention that moderate gun restrictions, essentially what the United States currently has, are preferable to unregulated gun access. Now, wait, I just lost my mic. Am I off? Wait. Okay, so am I back? Can you see me? I'm going to pass the mic. Oh, you can't see me? Okay, so I will let you go ahead and introduce this because I've used basically all my time. But as long as you can see me, that's all that matters.
Okay, well, I was about to exit out because it appears that I thought I was tomorrow with Ben. I thought this was a discussion, but Friday at 8 o'clock. Okay, so yeah, I'll finish up with you, and then I'll talk with him. Sorry, I'm messaging him right now. Okay, so I don't know what your contention is because you dropped out the pretty much 2.5 minutes. So I actually think that the right to own guns is pretty much basically almost an absolute right. I don't see what the necessary restriction is. I do believe it is a slippery slope, and I can quote Nancy Pelosi that says, "Oh, the opposition will call it a slippery slope, and I hope so," unquote. So there is no such thing as moderate gun restrictions. They are moderate, and then they're intense, and then they're absolute. That's the way it has always gone historically. The right to own a gun is an absolute individual right. We can talk, I don't know if you want to talk about the right to own a gun in terms of the Second Amendment, or if you want to talk about it in general. So I'm going to give it back to you because I don't know what your contention is.
Okay, so you talk about Nancy Pelosi. My response to that would be that there was a Gallup poll, and I posted it on your wall, which said that 76% of Americans do not want a ban on guns. Just because Nancy Pelosi and some of the far left might want that, and I'm actually debating Cynthia on this right after this debate, some of the far left might want that, but that's a very, very out there position. Most people do not actually advocate for that. Most Americans want basic, sensible, moderate gun restrictions. Now, you then talked about how a right to guns is an absolute right. I have a couple of responses to this. My first response is, what is an absolute right? My second response is, where does this right come from? Are you saying that because of God, there is then a right to own guns? My third response is that the Second Amendment doesn't even say that. Let me read the Second Amendment to you. The Second Amendment, oh wait, I forgot I restarted my computer, so I have to actually open up my document again. The Second Amendment says that a, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, end quote. So what that is saying is because we need to have a militia, therefore it will be acceptable for the people to have weapons. It does not say that they should have all weapons. It just says they should be able to own weapons, arms. Further, it also talks about how it will be a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. So this is not in any way saying that there will be ultimate guns, you can do anything you want with any gun in the world. It is saying that there will be some regulations for the purpose of keeping a standing army, a militia. So this is very different from the idea that you can have any weapon that you want. The fourth response I'm going to add on this is that of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the entity that interprets the Constitution, determining what is and is not protected by the Constitution. The Supreme Court has said in Heller versus Columbia that people have a right to certain guns. They do not have an absolute right to any gun that they want, which is completely in line with the basic reading of that amendment. Now, let me go into my contention because I didn't have much of the time. My contention is that common sense gun policies save lives. And this is actually backed up by the data. Daniel Webster, a professor at Johns Hopkins, was able to do an analysis of different gun legislation in the United States and elsewhere. And he found that if we simply followed the basic data and was able to have common sense, just enforce the current laws that we have, we would be able to cut back on 30 to 50% of gun murders. So the standard that I would have presented had I had time would be just that the goal should be protect human life. If we protect human life, then we have benefited society as a whole. We know we can do this simply by getting through with common sense, moderate gun restrictions.
Okay, so let's see. Number one, I think you said advocate. Now, there's a difference between what people want and what they advocate for. And this is the whole slippery slope argument, is that somebody starts, they want to get way over here, but they're not going to start there. They're going to start at some point that people go, oh yeah, I guess we could do that. They get to that point, the Hegelian dialectic, they get to that point. Eventually, in the long run, they're going to hit that goal. So there are people, yes, there are people on the far left, which you admit, they advocate for complete confiscation. Feinstein, Pelosi, Reid, all these people want confiscation. You yourself posted a Daily Show that supported the Australian gun ban. They call it buybacks, but that would imply the government had the guns, sold it to you, and are buying them back. So, I mean, it's not even a sensible term, but that's what they use when government takes your forcibly, well, usually it's, in the US, it's typically so-called voluntary, but it's when the government buys guns. Usually they're either guns that have been used in crimes. It's a nice way to get rid of your crime, your criminal gun. It's also a good way to get rid of broken guns. So I can sell my broken $20 gun for $200. So that's typically what they do. Second, it is a right. So, I mean, we can get into the Second Amendment. Again, this is why I want to say, I don't know if you want to talk about Second Amendment or if you want to talk about it, the right to bear arms as a right in and of itself. The Second Amendment was not, it's not just an amendment to the Constitution that they threw in there. These are, the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Constitution says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, or alienable typically, but I'd say unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I talked about that yesterday. And the right to protect yourself, the right of self-protection, self-preservation, is an absolute right. That is the most basic and fundamental right that there is. I own myself, and we go from there. So again, the amendment, it is a bill. It is an amendment that is, they took the Bill of Rights, which are individual rights, saying that the government cannot, they're negative rights. So the government cannot infringe upon your right to bear arms. Now they didn't have muskets only, they had all kinds of weapons, and nowhere in there does it say that you could have a single shot musket, but you can't have one of the, they had basically an air machine gun at the time. So they didn't say you couldn't have a cannon. In fact, they did allow individuals to own such weapons.
All right, so you began by talking about how my poll showing that the vast majority of Americans do not want a gun ban, you responded to that by saying there's a difference between what they want versus what they advocate. Like, for instance, how Nancy Pelosi and some of the other Democrats will advocate for a gun ban. Now, once again, these are the extremes. We're not talking about the extremes. That's not what I believe. That's not what the majority of Americans believe. That's what the extremes believe. We're talking about what would be a sensible, logical reform. We're not talking about what the extremes might believe on an issue. You then talk about how I had posted an article from The Daily Show talking about Australia. That wasn't me. Eli Ritter posted that on my wall because he wants a complete gun ban in the United States, which I disagree with, as does, well, actually, Cynthia, who I will be debating right after this, will also advocate a complete gun ban. But again, I disagree with that concept. I like guns. I'm a fan of guns. And I think that the majority of Americans are as well, as that poll I talked about was talking about. You talked about how the Second Amendment, and you just talked about how it's acceptable according to the Second Amendment, but you didn't respond to any of the arguments that I presented in the speech just before this. I'm going to add another one here, which is that of the Founding Fathers didn't agree with your interpretation. The Founding Fathers themselves banned guns to African Americans. They also banned guns to people who they considered were going to revolt against them. There was no idea in the Founding Fathers that, oh, all guns must be allowed to all people. There's nothing in there that says that. The actual wording of the Second Amendment itself says well regulated, that they can regulate this right. They're saying that people can have a right to weapons, which is what the Supreme Court has agreed on as well in Columbia versus Heller, which is the law of the land, saying handguns and other such weapons are acceptable and can be owned by individuals. But that is different from the idea that they can have any weapon they want. That is the law of the land. That's what the Constitution says. That's what the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution to say. That's very different than your idea of unregulated gun access. Now let's talk about the potential solutions. I talked about how there was data showing that we can make things better. I would have gotten to this more in my first speech, but my computer wasn't working. But here's some of the things that we have been able to identify. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, 70% of violent killers had a prior arrest record. We already have a law on the books that prevents felons from owning weapons. If we were to enforce this law, we would be able to remove 70% of the actual killings by guns that are occurring. This is a sensible, basic, moderate gun restriction, and it makes perfect sense. If someone has already shown a tendency toward violence, those are the sorts of people who the people should be protected against. That's a simple, basic, common sense solution. If we were to enforce this law, we would be able to cut out on 70% of gun killings.
I think you actually kind of argued my point there. I mean, the government, yes, they regulated people that they were afraid of. So this is why the founders actually wanted the individuals to have guns. The militia was anybody over 16 and under, I think, 45. All males between 16 and 45 were to have a gun because they were the militia. It doesn't say anything about regulating what they can have. It says the militia itself, and it says, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is, every individual, the people, have a right to keep and bear arms, and it shall not be infringed. Some of your other points, SCOTUS is not law of the land. SCOTUS interprets things. They don't make laws. Some of the other points that I didn't get to. So again, the SCOTUS one, the idea of saving lives, again, you're kind of arguing my point there, is that we could have all sorts of laws, but criminals, they don't really care. So as you mentioned, people that have already been convicted of crimes are not legally allowed to own a gun. Yet, shocking, criminals don't care. They go, they get the guns. And we already have laws that are supposed to protect people. We have laws against murder. We have laws against shooting in the middle of the city, but people don't care because they're criminals. So if they want to do something, they're going to get a gun. This guy, and again, so we're talking about this. This kind of goes back to the idea of what people actually want. You mentioned a bunch of people that do want absolute gun bans. Are you calling them left-wing nut jobs? I'm assuming you wouldn't to their face, but I think people that advocate for total bans are left-wing nut jobs, and they've never seen a gun in real life, would be my bet. Most of them don't even know what a gun is, hardly. Most of them couldn't tell you anything about it. So they've actually done studies, and this was on, I think it was 2020, and they had little children in the classroom and their parents watching through a two-way mirror, and they left a gun in the couch, and the little kids, the kids that grew up around guns, knew not to touch the gun. The kids that their parents were terrified and the thing might go off in the middle of the night anytime, might kill everybody in the house, some ridiculous fears they have. The kids that had that fear, whose parents had that fear, picked up the gun and played with it. But again, the kids who grew up around guns knew not to touch that gun. So if you teach your children respect for guns and respect for life, which I would disagree that the left really has any respect for life. They don't actually want to save lives. After all, I mean, you're talking about the very pro-abortion. That's 50+ million people in the last 40+ years. So I can get to some of your other points after this if you want.
Yeah, I'll just give it back to you because might as well. But I have a question. Do you agree that the goal of policy, especially with regards to an issue like guns, would be to save lives? Would you agree that that's a reasonable goal?
No, I don't think that's the goal at all, because they don't save lives. We know that places where there are more legal guns, there are lower crime rates. So places where guns have been banned have higher crime rates. The most dangerous city, the United States is one of the safest countries in the world if you take out gun-free Chicago and gun-free Detroit, gun-free New York City, places like that, gun-free DC. This just goes to show that laws don't really matter. People don't care. If you're going to kill somebody, you're already breaking a law. You're already breaking, again, and you're breaking what I would say the natural laws as far as ending someone's life. You're completely violating their, well, theoretically, that would be property rights that I own myself. But no, I don't think that's the goal at all. I think the goal typically is more control. You just mentioned it in your two pieces ago that the founders, they did not create this law. They did not, or this right. They did not give people the right. They recognized the pre-existing right. So the pre-existing right of self-defense by any means necessary. And guns are the best, guns are the great equalizer. So men are typically stronger than women. Guns save millions of lives every year. And I would say, if you have a girlfriend or something, teach them how to use a gun, because that's the only thing that's really going to protect somebody. What do they say when seconds matter, the police are only 7 to 15 minutes away? So, guns are the great equalizer. Guns save lives. So I think if you want to save lives, you should advocate for less regulations in guns. Again, John Locke talks about that in his piece. I again point out that the United States is one of the safest countries on earth as far as violent crime. And we have approximately 500 million. They have no idea how many guns there are in the United States, but they estimate it's approximately 450 to 550 million guns. That's almost 2 per person. And again, places where there are more guns are safer places. So if you want to advocate for saving lives, which I don't believe that the left actually wants to do, because as I pointed out before, but you should advocate for less regulations and possibly more guns even.
All right, so you kind of rejected the standard, but then you basically accepted it. Because I think that what you're saying is that with more guns, we save more lives. And so ultimately, both of us are ultimately trying to save the most amount of lives. If that's the case, remember, I'm not saying ban guns. I like guns. I think guns are great. I agree with you that they can be a very useful tool. However, what I'm saying is that there are common sense, simple restrictions that can and should be passed. Most of them we actually already have. And these are things that are able to statistically benefit the most amount of lives. Now, you talk about how the founders had regulations on gun rights, and you said that backed up your side. Actually, it doesn't. If the founders had restrictions, some restrictions, but still allowed guns, that's exactly what I'm saying. We should allow guns, but we can have some restrictions. This is also what the Supreme Court has ruled in Columbia versus Heller. It's exactly the law of the land. You talked about SCOTUS isn't the law of the land, but as you yourself agree, SCOTUS is the group that interprets the Constitution. And their interpretation is exactly what I'm saying. Now, you, in the speech before that, you talked about how what I'm proposing would not save lives because criminals don't care. Well, actually, remember, what I'm proposing is not a ban on guns. I think guns can be very useful. What I'm proposing is simple, basic restrictions, many of which are already in the United States Code, which simply need better enforcement. Let's look at some of the statistics on what happens when these things are done. Here's some data from a Johns Hopkins study, which analyzed data on different gun rates from the last 20 years. They found that Missouri's background check program had reduced gun murders by 14%. They found that it had reduced Connecticut's by 40%. And they had also reduced overall suicide rates in both states by 15%. Neither state had experienced any increased murder rate from any other weapons. All that those background checks did was cut down on murders by weeding out some of the dangerous people from obtaining weapons. Another study found an overall analysis of nations and states who had denied handgun purchases to prior felons had reduced their murder rate by 20 to 30%. Overall, what you see from this is that with simple, basic reforms, just the things that everybody wants, don't let criminals have guns, have background checks on these things. 88% of Americans, according to the study that I showed you earlier, 88% of Americans want universal background checks, while 76% of them still believe in a right to own weapons. There is a middle ground here. That's the middle ground that I would advocate. Simple reforms, simple restrictions are better than unregulated gun access. Both of us agree that guns are good. There should be guns, that's fine. But simple restrictions is the best way to save lives, which is what both of us agree is the goal.
Well, being that we are just in the moments after, the days after a shooting, all of the mass shootings, these are people that pass background checks. So background checks don't seem to do anything. Now, I realize that a lot of background checks have stopped people from getting guns legally, so they go and get them illegally. Now, as far as who should be restricted from owning a gun, well, we've seen governments in the past, in the founding days, you know, certain people that they wanted to keep under their boot were not allowed to own guns. This is really the origination of gun control in the United States, was to prevent black people from owning guns, because you wouldn't want, if black people could own guns, they might rise up and, you know, throw their chains off. This is a picture I showed last night. This is Lily Tang Williams, I think I want to say. Anyway, she ran for I think Senator of Colorado. I was once a slave, I will never be again. She's holding her AR-15. She's from China. Now we know China, 65 million big gun-free zone, 65 million dead, Tiananmen Square, all that. So that's what happens when you totally ban guns from a country. Now, I don't want to get into what I think would happen. There's not enough time for that. But what I would say is, again, John Locke has shown that more guns, less crime. So if you want to look at countries that have banned guns, and again, I know you're saying restrictions, but how far, you know, you haven't really listed any restrictions. You've listed restrictions that are already on the books and have stopped nobody. So I don't know what the point. I mean, we could say that, yeah, you're right. You forfeit your right to own a gun if you violate somebody else's rights. So if you're going to be a convicted murderer or something like that, then you are giving up certain rights. You're giving up your right of freedom, right? You're going into prison. So we could talk about that. But UK, immediately after the United Kingdom banned their guns, their violent crime rate shot up. Their violent crime rate is higher than it is in the US. Australia, you know, again, back to the video that someone posted on your wall. Australians, they say, we haven't had a single mass shooting since we banned guns. Total lie. They've actually had more per capita than we have in the United States since then. Again, I mentioned the study that people that grow up around guns tend to be less apt to use them against others that are taught what guns are. They're less apt to have accidents with them. And again, I don't think that the goal of the people that are advocating for gun control is to save lives because they only advocate in this one area.
There's a middle ground here. You continually talk about how banning guns is a bad idea, how it's unsafe to do so, and I agree. I think that doesn't make any sense. What I am advocating is that we would have some level of restrictions in order to combat the things that could happen. This does not intend to stop all gun violence. I mean, if we could, I would love that. But what I am looking at is things that statistically can save lives. It doesn't matter if they save all lives. We can't do that. There's going to be people who are going to go around laws. I agree with you on that. But the goal is to help the most amount of people that we can. So before I respond to your issues here, I still haven't seen any reason from you. The only reason I've seen for why unregulated gun access is better than moderate gun restrictions, there's this supposed natural right to have unregulated guns. Do you have any other reasons for believing that unregulated guns is better than basic restrictions?
Well, again, I would say that the statistics, John Locke has shown, he's written books, he's done enormous amounts of studies that show that places with more guns are safer. And again, you can look at country by country, and as far as the West anyways, countries that allow people to carry guns are safer. And you say moderate restrictions, but I don't know what that means. I mean, moderate could mean anything. You know, how far are you willing to take that? Because again, the people that are pushing it, moderate to them would be only their bodyguards are allowed to have them, right? I mean, you can see this in a lot of people are advocating for more and 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 more gun control, is they all are surrounded by armed bodyguards. So typically the idea here is, yes, I'm okay with guns for myself, but not for you. That's the typical response. I would say that the Second Amendment Foundation, the John, what's the name of that? The GOA, Gun Owners of America. These other places do a lot of work, and they show that places with more guns, less restrictions, tend to be safer places. Guns, people being allowed to own guns outside of their house has between 1 and 2 million crimes prevented every year. Now, these are difficult statistics to hold. They have to be estimated because if you simply show someone your gun and they walk away, they're not going to count that as a statistic because nothing actually happened. But they do estimate it, and they find that approximately 1.5 to 2 million incidents every year that save lives, prevent rapes, all of those things. So don't believe the hype about gun shootings in the U.S. You know, most of the statistics they talk about with guns in the U.S. are dishonest. So again, I'm just saying that I think more guns is a good thing, because you can pass all sorts of restrictions, and if someone wants to commit a crime, they don't really care. They go out, they get the gun from a van and on 3rd Street or whatever it is.
Overall, I have not seen any reason from you still that says that unregulated guns is preferable to some slight restrictions. You've questioned me on what restrictions would be. All right, here are a couple of ideas. First of all, the fact that 88% of Americans support universal background checks. Let's implement that. We already have background checks to a certain level. Let's get it to universal level. We can remove the ability of criminals to be holding weapons. Obviously, there's still the possibility for them to get it illegally, but we can at least make their ease of access towards these weapons much harder. We can make it more difficult for them to go through with their crimes just by restricting them from having legally obtained weapons. These are common sense reforms. These are things that most Americans would clearly get behind, and statistically they do get behind. There's a good reason for this. More than that, we need to really enforce the current law. We have current law that is supposed to be able to protect this, but oftentimes it slips through the cracks. It isn't being enforced as much at localities, which I would certainly advocate that it should be. If we enforce the current law, if we stop criminals from obtaining legal weapons, and if we close loopholes in current laws, we can be able to cut back on gun violence. Now, I'm going to throw this question back on you. If you're asking me for what I would advocate, what would you advocate? When you say unregulated gun access, what does that mean? Does that mean every single weapon possible should be owned by the people? Nukes, chemical weapons, biological weapons, tanks? What exactly is acceptable? The other thing you talked about was how John Locke had studied guns, and how you talked about a couple of other things where guns worked. Again, I agree with you. Guns are a good option. But the question of this debate is not, are guns good? Guns are good. We both agree. The question is, can we save lives by having moderate restrictions on guns? And the answer is, statistically, whenever it has been shown, if you put simple, basic restrictions in place, you save lives. You prevent the access of dangerous people from obtaining weapons, which saves lives. We can have guns. We can still have them. It's great. We'll get all the advantages you're talking about, but we can limit the amount of potential harm by passing simple restrictions and keeping the current restrictions that we currently have. I would remind the audience and yourself as well that any restrictions that are in the status quo right now are the restrictions that I, as the pro, am defending. So unless Nelson's going to show that these are bad laws, which he hasn't shown, I haven't seen anything from Nelson that says we should change it to go to unregulated gun access. So Nelson, on your case, why should we go back to unregulated gun access? And what exactly does that mean? Does that mean you think that nukes are okay? What exactly is the limit for you?
Well, I don't know what nukes and tanks and missiles have to do with the right to keep and bear arms. We're talking about bearing arms. So generally arms are considered some type of weapon, gun specifically. So yeah, I would say even though if somebody wants to buy an F-16, I think anybody that can afford an F-16 is probably not someone that we need to worry about. We haven't seen any really big thing that's happened from somebody obtaining one of those. I mean, I think that if somebody really wanted to get their hands on one, they probably could. But I think gun restrictions that should go away, specifically gun-free zones. Since at least 1950, all but 2 public mass shootings in America, and mass shooting, it's there. The actual definition by Congress in 2014, I think, is mass murder, which is the death of 3 or more people. So that's generally, mass shooting is a shooting that kills 3 or more people, not including the gunman. Since 1950, all but 2 of them have taken place in, guess where? 1, 2, 3, gun-free zones, right? So gun restrictions in these gun-free zones create shooting galleries because after all, nobody wants competition, right? If I'm going to kill as many people as possible, I'm going to go to the place where nobody is going to shoot back. And that's where they always go. One of those exceptions was the effective gun-free zone, which is a Democrat rally in Arizona, right? Because, the likelihood of a Democrat carrying guns themselves is pretty low. So we'll call that a gun-free zone, and we'll take it down to 1. Generally, they're in schools, which are gun-free zones. So those are places that I think teachers should be allowed to have a gun. You can train them, make sure that they're well-trained. And, of course, you want them locked away. But even so, I would say gun owners are generally very responsible people. The Simpsons had a great episode. Homer joins the NRA. And I think it's a very leftist show, but what I kind of saw in the episodes, it kind of made fun of what people think NRA people are, where you're going around his house, turning out the lights by shooting them, or he opens his soda can and shoots them, and the NRA finds out, and they kick him out. Right? They say, well, that's not what we do here. You're out of the club, and then he's all disappointed. So I think it's a great episode. So 2 things, universal background checks. I don't know. I would be against that. I don't want any kind of record whatsoever where the government knows who wants a gun and who has a gun. When we talk about background checks and then we get into registration, New York has registration, and guess what? The local paper published the addresses of everybody on that gun registration list. You mentioned criminals with guns. They're already illegal to have guns. They can't have guns right now.
Statistically, when you implement simple, basic restrictions, the level of killing goes down. That's, you talk about how we currently have some of these things I'm talking about. Exactly. And they have been proven to statistically reduce violence. Both you and I agree that the goal here is to save lives. You think we can do it by allowing more guns? I agree. I think that guns are great. We should allow guns. The difference is, while I think we should have a lot of guns, I also would contend that there should be some moderate gun restrictions, similar to what the current status quo has, enforce those current laws, expound on a couple aspects of them to close some of the loopholes. That's my overall policy here, and I don't think we've seen anything from you that would contradict that contention. How you weren't advocating for nukes or anything, you would be okay with F-16s, but that you were mainly focusing on arms. I'm going to ignore the F-16 thing here because I think that that's a reasonable position to just be focusing on arms. Now, here's where we get into the actual Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Columbia versus Heller ruled that every citizen does have a right, and I agree with this, they do have a right to bear arms. I think you would agree with that as well. But what they ruled, and what the Supreme Court has always held, and what the Constitution itself specifically says, is that it can be well regulated, that it is for the purpose of militia, and even the Founding Fathers themselves had implemented other restrictions on that in the past. Clearly, they did not think that there was an unregulated, complete, have-at-it buffet of guns. That wasn't there in the Constitution. That wasn't in the way that the Founding Fathers acted. That wasn't in the interpretation the Supreme Court has given us. And it's not even better if you do it that way. Statistically, you save more lives by implementing basic common sense gun restrictions. This is the middle ground here. This is what the vast majority of Americans want. You are on the far right. You actually are further to the right than the National Rifle Association, which, I mean, you're entitled to that opinion, you are. But at the same time, most Americans would prefer simple, basic restrictions to prevent things that are happening. Criminals should not be able to access weapons. Do you think they should be able to access weapons? I agree that there are certain laws that are already on the books that are supposed to prevent them, and yes, they don't always work. But they do make it harder. They prevent the ease of access for criminals to be able to get weapons. We have universal background checks, we're mostly universal background checks, for that reason, to prevent the ease of access of criminals to get weapons. Do you disagree with those? Well, you said you disagreed with background checks because you don't like gun registries. But do you disagree with the idea of preventing criminals from having weapons?
Well, I already spoke on that, and I thought plenty of detail. But again, with universal background checks, you get universal background checks is equivalent to a registry, and historically, registry means the government knows exactly where to go and get them. So I guess my question to you is well, you're not advocating for a total ban, but would you not agree that that seems to be where we're headed? And you probably would disagree with that, but we are moving in that direction, and we do have people in very powerful places that are pushing that. So every time something happens, that's what they advocate for. They advocate more and more gun restrictions. So you want to say moderate gun restrictions. Well, moderate leads to more moderate, or I guess less moderate, but moderate gun restrictions leads to more moderate gun restrictions. And eventually you get to the point to where what they want, and Nancy Pelosi, again, herself, the head of the Democratic Party, says she hopes it's a slippery slope to a total ban. As far as criminals, I mentioned that I said that criminals forfeit certain rights, such as freedom. Universal background checks, I'm against those. And we've seen in this country, as gun ownership has gone up, crime has gone down. So we've seen the opposite in other countries, such as similar countries, the UK and Australia.
All right, so you talk about how moving towards a gun ban is ultimately what any restriction will do. This is false, and it's actually statistically false. Right now, 76% of Americans are against the concept of banning guns. They're against it. In fact, 30 years ago, only 40% of Americans were able to answer that same question the same way. 60% of Americans used to want to ban guns. But over time, the perception is shifting the other way. More Americans want to protect the idea of having guns. I am one of them. But at the same time, I think there is a basic fact that when you protect the people, you're able to save lives. This has been statistically proven in this round. We've seen multiple examples of where statistically, when you have
basic restrictions, you're able to prevent criminals from having weapons. The simple background checks catch the mentally ill. Some of them, not always. Look, it's not always going to work, but statistically, it makes things better. It saves lives, and that is why you should vote pro in this round.